The year is 1700. Russia, Sweden, and Poland are embroiled in a conflict that will shape the balance of power in Eastern Europe for the following centuries. In the wake of this war, Sweden will lie defeated, Poland will have been plundered, and Russia, headed by Peter the Great, will emerge as the dominant power in Eastern Europe for the next 300 years. But how did this happen? Why did they fight? And who were the men that led these nations to war? The king is dead. It is February of 1679, and Charles XI, the King of Sweden, lies dead in the ground. His child son, Charles XII, is coronated king. Miles away in Moscow, Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia, realizes that this is his opportunity to regain Russia's lost possessions of the Baltic, and with them, gain what he needs to make Russia the greatest power in Eastern Europe. In Krakow, Augustus II, Peter's good friend and the ruler of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, looks out on his once great nation. Then he looks north, thinking this would be his chance to reclaim his country's power and prestige. These two great nations of Eastern Europe began to plot in secret. In fact, they had been plotting since before Peter was Tsar. Robert Frost saying that while Peter was in Krakow, the two, lubricated by 4 days of drinking, had sealed their friendship with a formal agreement to wage a war on Charles. Now, these two men had the power and an opportunity to fulfill their drinking agreement. The two nations plotted in secret, and soon they had an alliance with each other and Denmark, with the sole purpose of destroying the Swedish Empire. Soon, Russian and Danish armies were posed to launch an invasion of the Swedish Empire. The order was sent, and the armies advanced. Swedish cities across their empire were put under siege, and the veteran Swedish army was mobilized. The table was set, the cards were dealt, and everyone was playing all in. Sweden's situation seemed to be impossible to emerge victorious from. Toning in northern Germany was put under siege by the Danes, and Narva in Estonia was put under siege by the Russian army, headed by the Russian Tsar himself. The Swedish were completely surrounded, and they had a 17-year-old on the throne. Charles XII, the boy king who no one thought could win. He would soon shock the world. He quickly moved his forces to face the Danish army, and with the British and Dutch fleet's aid, the Swedish fleet outmatched and outmaneuvered the Danish fleet, landing near Copenhagen, forcing the Danes to sue for peace on Swedish terms. Charles then turned his army immediately back east, transporting them to the eastern Baltic. With his relatively small force, he made his way to Narva to relieve the tired defenders. His army arrived during a snowstorm, and Charles, ignoring the advice of his advisors, proceeded to launch a devastating attack on the unaware Russians. The Swedes, spurred on by their easy victory over Denmark, advanced through the snowstorm, crashing to their poorly trained and equipped adversary. The fighting was quick and brutal. The snow restricted visibility and movement, so the Russians hardly knew what was happening. By the end of the day, the Russians had lost nearly half their forces, whilst the Swedes had come out relatively unscathed. The one mistake that Charles made was not pursuing the retreating Russians further. Had he done this, he may have been able to end the war right there. This decision would come back to haunt him. Instead, he turned his attention south to Poland and Lithuania, who had feigned neutrality up to that point. Charles saw through this facade and launched an invasion of the Commonwealth. In a series of battles, Charles would push Augustus II out of Poland and back into his home territory of Saxony, dethroning him along the way, replacing him with a weak but loyal Polish noble. In this campaign, Charles single-handedly forced Poland and Lithuania to accept the consensus that Europe had come to, that they would never again be a great power. The past decades of decay and internal conflict had taken their toll on the Commonwealth. Their military was a shadow of its former self, and the authority of the crown was almost non-existent. In fact, the reason that Poland had invaded Sweden at the outbreak of the war can likely be attributed to internal squabbling by Polish and Lithuanian nobles. Whereas in centuries past, the winged hussars had sacked the capital of Russia, now all it took for Charles to conquer the Polish capital was a knock on the gate and the determination to hold it open. Charles had literally walked to the front gate of Krakow and asked for entry. When the guards opened the gate to see who it was, he barred open the door, and his men, waiting behind him, stormed in. Charles, a relatively inexperienced leader, had brought Poland to its knees. For the next few years, Charles would spend most of his time in Poland and Saxony, rebuffing attempts from Augustus to reclaim the Commonwealth. Nearly 8 years after the outbreak of the war, Charles, confident with his position in Poland, launched his long-anticipated invasion of Russia. Peter had not been idle in the time since his and Charles's last encounter. He had reformed the military and drilled his men rigorously. He would not be humiliated again. He had also conquered parts of the Baltic coast in Charles's absence, upon which he had built a fortress named St. Petersburg. That fort would become the capital of his empire. Similarly, Charles did not been idle either. He had raised his army to 40,000, 3 times the amount with which he had bested Peter previously. In addition to this, he had formed an alliance with the Cossacks, a nomadic group who wanted to overthrow Russia. Charles began his invasion on January the 1st of 1708, crossing the Vistula River into Russia. For the first few days of their march, they were able to live the land. However, a few weeks in, after an indecisive skirmish with the Russians, they were faced with a completely barren landscape. Peter had begun a scorched earth campaign, knowing that he could not defeat Charles in battle. He had any town in the path of Charles set alight, slaughtered all the animals, and burned the fields. This had a drastic effect on Charles's army, decreasing their morale and making it almost impossible for them to press deeper into Russia. This can largely be attributed to the fact that the armies of the time would rarely bring supplies with them, instead choosing to live off the land. This was because of the expense of transporting supplies and the negative effect on the army's speed. This was amplified by Charles' strategy, which was dependent on quickly ensnaring the Russians in a decisive battle, forcing them to make peace on Swedish grounds. However, this led him to abandon the few supplies that he may have brought. To make things even worse, the reinforcements that Charles was expecting were destroyed by the Russian army, along with the supplies that they were bringing. Then the Cossack army arrived, with a measly 1,200 men. The Cossacks, too, had been crushed by the Russians, and their capital had been razed. Then the final disaster that beset the Swedes came, the Great Frost of 1708, one of the coldest winters for centuries. Of the original army that entered Russia, only half survived through the winter. Now Peter was ready to face Charles. He stopped to meet the wounded and demoralized Swedish army that had been following him. The two forces met at a battle that would decide the outcome of the war, Poltava. Charles, in his final gamble to win, attempted to charge and break through the Russian lines, routing them like he did at Narva. But this was not the same army that he faced at Narva, and this battle would not end the same way. The Russians stood their ground, and the Swedes wavered and broke. The field was Peter's, and Charles had been handed his first major defeat. The Swedish army was crushed, and the veterans that had carried Charles to success were dead or captured. Charles would return to Sweden, but it was clear which way the war was going. Upon hearing of the Swedish defeat, Denmark renewed their invasion of Sweden, and Augustus successfully overthrew the puppet king on the throne of the Commonwealth. In addition to this, Prussia and Great Britain, fresh from their victory in the War of Spanish Succession, would soon declare war on Sweden. Charles would fight on for 9 more years, even managing to defeat Denmark and Poland in battle. However, this would all end at a fort in Norway with a gunshot. A sharpshooter hit their mark. Charles lay dead in the fields of Norway outside of a fort which he had been besieging. Sweden would carry on the fight for 2 more years, but without Charles, they had little will to fight. Shortly after, Sweden began negotiations for peace. They ceded most of their eastern Baltic possessions to the Russians in the Treaty of Nystad. Most of their German possessions were made independent or ceded to Prussia, the state that would go on to found Germany, and finally they ceded several parts of Scandinavia to Denmark. They only made peace with Poland over a decade later, giving them nothing. By the end of it all, Sweden had been humbled before the world, and would never again rise to hold such influence in European politics. Russia emerged as the dominant power in Eastern Europe, and since then has never really been challenged for that position. Poland-Lithuania only won a hollow victory. The several years of Swedish occupation and civil war had left the country in turmoil, and with the new emergence of Russia's superpower, the Commonwealth quickly fell under indirect control of Russia, Robert Frost describing Peter as being the arbiter of Polish politics for the following decades. Finally, at the end of the 18th century, Russia, Prussia, and Austria all got together and divided Poland among themselves in a series of acts dubbed the Partitions of Poland. Poland and its people would tragically find themselves trapped between the 3 nations that had divided them, often becoming the battlefield of the 3 nations like in World War I and II. Poland would only lastingly re-emerge as a free and independent nation after the collapse of the USSR in the 1990s. In 1700, a war broke out. Nearly 20 years later, it ended, leaving a forever changed Europe in its wake. The triumph of Russia over Sweden in the Great Northern War cleared the way for Russia's tragic subjugation of the Polish people and Russia's subsequent unwavering dominance over Eastern Europe for the next 300 years.